We'll cover how to install Ubuntu in Oracle VM VirtualBox Manager. The first thing that you'll want to do is open up your browser and get a copy of the image. It'll be an ISO format that you'll want to use to install it into VirtualBox. So the first thing that you'll do is get a copy of the image. And I'll navigate to ubuntu.com/download and navigate to the desktop image. For demonstration purposes, we'll just do the desktop. So if you're just wanting to try out Linux and don't have a reason to use the server or a minimal or a cloud version, some other version, then go ahead and just use the desktop. And I usually pick just the most recent version of Ubuntu unless I have a reason to use a previous version. So here I'll pick the Ubuntu 15.10 64-bit. Since I have a fixed 64-bit computer, that's what I'll pick. And the download it'll take you to a page where you can select various features that you can pay for if you want to. If you have a reason to pay for these, go ahead and do it. But for demonstration purposes, I don't have a need to do it. So enter 0 for all of them and your download will start. If you have a copy of an image from somewhere else, you don't necessarily have to download it, obviously. But whatever you do, make sure you download an ISO because that's what we'll use to install into VirtualBox. So either download from Ubuntu or get an alternative download and allow that to download. And when it downloads, we'll start the installation process. While your image is downloading, what you can do is you can go ahead and set up VirtualBox. You can create a new virtual machine with some settings, so that way whenever your image is done downloading or you have it, you can go ahead and start the installation process. So start by clicking the New button, and you'll need to create a name for the virtual machine that you're creating. So I'll name mine something descriptive. So since this is Ubuntu 15.10 64 desktop version, 64-bit, that's what I will name it. And in the type, you'll want to select Linux, and if you select the version drop down, you'll see multiple versions of Ubuntu and other flavors like Red Hat, Turbo Linux, and such. So I'll select Ubuntu 64-bit since that's what we're going to install. But if you have a 32-bit PC that you're trying to install this in, go ahead and download the 32-bit ISO and select 32-bit from the drop down. So we'll select 64-bit and then click the next button. And you'll be ready to set the amount of RAM that you want to dedicate to your virtual machine. So I've got a little bit of RAM here, so I typically like to use at least 1 gig of RAM. That way when the desktop opens up, it'll have enough memory to do a little bit of display and a little more processing when needed. And you can, if you decide that you need more later when you're running, you notice you don't have enough RAM when you're running your virtual machine, you can always edit it later, and I'll show you how to do that. So if you have it available, set 1 gig and then we'll click next. And I usually leave the default for the hard disk. Here we're going to create a hard disk, and it's telling us that it recommends a size of 8 gig. So we'll do create hard disk now and click the create button. And here's many different hard disks that you can create. So I like to leave it default. Just select VDI and then click next. And here you'll have the option to do dynamically allocated or fixed size. Again, leave it as default and allow your storage to be dynamically allocated. And in the next window, you'll have the option of naming your hard drive. I like to leave it default. You can rename it if you want to. I haven't come across any instances where I needed to rename it, so I just leave it default. And if you want to allocate more than 8 gigs, you can set this here. If you're going to be doing an installation where you want to install many different applications and programs, you'll want to increase this accordingly. So since I'm doing a very basic install, I'll just leave it at 8 gig and click the create, and our virtual machine is created and ready to boot up and install an operating system. So in the meantime, we'll continue to let the ISO download. And when your image is finished downloading, the next thing we'll want to do is go ahead and boot the virtual machine and install the operating system. So there's two ways that you can insert the disk and tell it to install the operating system. The first is through the settings menu. Click on the settings button, then go to storage, and in storage there'll be two controllers. An IDE is where our disk drive is going to be. So if you actually want to insert a CD into the drive, you can click on this little DVD CD here, and you can point it to choose virtual optical disk file. So that's the ISO that we just downloaded. So you'll want to browse to wherever your ISO file is, and you'll select it. That's one way you can do it. And I'll demonstrate the other way as well. So you would click OK if this is how you wanted to do it. If you wanted to do it the other way, you could just start the virtual machine without a disk in it, and whenever it starts, it will prompt you for the disk that you want to install. So you can just browse to the same place that we just demonstrated earlier. So select the ISO and then click Start, and then your virtual machine will begin to boot. And again, just remember that whenever this is booting, it won't be in full screen mode. It will need guest editions. We'll have to insert a guest edition CD after the operating system installed if you want to be able to run the operating system in full screen mode. So while it's installing, we'll have to deal with a smaller window into the screen for the installation of the operating system. So just give it a minute to boot up into the main screen, and you'll have an option to pick your language here. And you'll have two options. You can try Ubuntu or you can install Ubuntu. If you just wanted to mess around a little bit with Linux without having anything persistent, you could just click the try button and it would boot directly into the operating system. But we'll demonstrate installation. So click the Install Ubuntu button, and you'll be taken to the next screen. Here it'll just verify that you have at least the minimal required drive space and that you're connected to the internet. If you wanted to, if you were going to have a persistent version and you wanted to be able to update and you wanted your operating system up to date for more than testing, you would maybe want to click download updates while installing and install third-party software. But for the purposes of this, it'll install a lot quicker if we don't select those, and we will just click the continue button. And here you can select to encrypt and use LVM. LVM will allow you to do some partitioning and take snapshots of your drive, which is a little more advanced. And you can click that if you want to, and if you're well versed enough to know how to do it. So we will click and select Erase Disk and install Ubuntu, and click the Install Now button. And it will give us a preview, and go ahead and click the continue button, and it will start erasing the disk, the virtual disk that we created, and it will begin installing the operating system. The next window is where you select your time zone. If you want to select a different time zone, you just move your mouse and select the one that you want. Since I'm in Central, I'll just leave it at Chicago. You can change your city name here if you want to. And click the continue. And the next stage is for your keyboard layout. Typically, whenever I'm going through to create an operating system, I just leave it at English. But if you have a different keyboard, you can click the Detect Keyboard Layout button, and it will ask you to press different keys. So you can pick the random key that you want to press. Make sure your mouse is on your screen, and then press the button. And it will give you a sequence of keys to press. And then after you press a couple keys, it'll ask you if your keyboard has certain keys. And that is a quote, and I'll click yes. And then it detected English. So if you have an English keyboard, you can just select English. Otherwise, go through the process I just did. And then next, click the continue button. And here you'll set up your default and root user. I'll just use user for username and password. If you're using it for something other than just testing, you'll want to use a secure name and password. So I'll just leave the default for the computer name. Well, actually, I'll just demonstrate changing it. And here, if you want it to be able to log in for you automatically, you can select that, but I like having a login. And it will begin the installation process. Here on this screen, it'll start installing your base operating system as well as some packages, and it will configure your hardware. And this process takes a couple minutes, but if you're not doing updates on the fly and installing third-party software, it'll be relatively quick, and you'll just wait for this process to complete. It should take 3 to 4 minutes. And once the installation is complete, you'll be prompted to restart and your operating system will be rebooted. One thing to keep in mind is that you will need to remove the disk from the virtual drive, or when you reboot, you'll be prompted to install it again. So go ahead and remove the disk from the virtual hard drive, and you'll be prompted to force unmount and then click the Restart Now button. And your operating system will begin to reboot. And again, when your operating system is booting, since we just did the base installation, the window and interface into your operating system is going to be smaller. You won't be able to operate it in full screen mode. So what you'll do is you'll allow it to boot, and once it's booted, you'll log into your operating system with the username and password that you just created. And if you want to be able to operate it in full screen mode, what you'll want to do is insert the guest editions CD image, and you can go through the process of installing the guest editions, which will allow you to operate in full screen mode, which you can check out a video on how to install that in another video, and there's many tutorials on both YouTube and the internet if you want to install the guest editions. And once that's done, you've now got a Ubuntu operating system installed, which you can use for any Linux testing that you want.